You see, the praise that I received as a senior here, or as a student here in general, was praise that was based on reality. I did well in squash, I got praise for that. I did well academically, I got praise for that. So it was real, it was grounded in reality, and yet I still felt like I had low self-esteem. In fact, the more praise I got, in many ways I felt that the rock became heavier and the mountain steeper. And that is not explained by traditional self-esteem research. Bednar and Pedersen talk about this paradox, and they give examples in their book. And this is the first place where I found someone talking about something that I'd experienced for many years. They talk about the paradox where very often success is associated with low levels of self-esteem. So let me read to you an account of a client that they had. They're a therapist who has been very successful. And here he is writing in his journal. For the past several years, I felt that my life was meaningless. This was an ironic state of affairs, considering all that I'd accomplished. Friends and relatives were always lauding me for my good looks and intelligence. I was the first person on either side of my family to graduate from college, doing so with honors. I had a good job with an important accounting firm. I had plenty of dates. By all outward appearances, my life was very fulfilling. Yet I was miserable and felt increasingly depressed. 6 months of psychotherapy had helped me to catch an occasional glimpse of the underlying cause of my unhappiness. It always seemed to involve low self-esteem or my disapproval of myself. Somehow it seemed like I really did have a low opinion of myself, but I found that idea confusing because of all the success in my life. Bednar and Pedersen talk about or introduce there the paradox of self-esteem. That's what they call it. Self-esteem is not associated with success. It's not associated with social status, with money. It's associated with other elements. In fact, as the paradox shows, very often more success leads to more difficulty in this realm. It was this difficulty that I wanted to explore and explored in my research. And this is the formulation that I introduced. The first level of self-esteem was a dependent self, because what I felt was that self-esteem as a construct was not enough. The contradictions there were plenty. The paradox there was not explained by the notion of self-esteem. So I divided self-esteem into 3 parts based on the work of Lovinger. She did her work back in the 60s, based on the work of Maslow, based on the work of Carl Rogers and Nathaniel Branden, who had talked about these things. But again, we're not in the majority. Most people who talked about self-esteem talked about it as a single construct. The second component, self-esteem that is not contingent on others. And finally, the third component essentially does not even need to be called self-esteem, simply a sense of self. Let me begin with each one, describing each one. And what I'll do in describing each one is talk about the 2 components of self-esteem. So essentially what I'll create is a 3x2. The 3 types of self-esteem, each one how it relates to worthiness, to self-respect, and how it relates to competence, the 2 components of Nathaniel Branden's work. So first of all, in terms of worthiness. In terms of worthiness, a person who has high dependent self-esteem is other-determined. They enjoy and they need the appraisal. If I do well in a lecture and I get external feedback, that makes me feel great. If I don't get great feedback, I feel awful. If I do well on an exam and I get good feedback from my TF or parents, I feel terrific. If someone tells me that they don't like something that I said, I feel awful. My life is constantly affected by what other people think or say, or what I think that they think or what I think that they mean. Constant evaluation. What do other people think of me? Like a looking glass, looking at other people as it reflects on me, and taking their evaluation as the sense of self that I have. People who have high dependent self-esteem are primarily, not only, but primarily motivated by what other people think and say. I will choose a job that will yield the most prestige, the highest social status, that will yield the most accolades and praise. I will choose a partner where I think most other people will approve of and like. Again, the sense of self contingent on other people. The important decisions are made based on other people's approval or disapproval. Second, sense of competence. The second component of self-esteem, according to Brandon, comes through other comparison. How am I doing relative to other people? If I do better than others on a test, I feel great. If others do better than I do, no matter how objectively good or bad it is, what matters is how I'm doing relative to others. William James captured this. He said, I, who have staked my all in psychology, am mortified when others know more psychology than I, compared to other people. In fact, most psychologists have talked about self-esteem as dependent self-esteem. The work of Cooley, talking about the looking glass metaphor. The work of Mead back in 1934, talking about dependent self-esteem. How we evaluate ourselves depends on what others say or think, or what we perceive they think or say about us. Most of the thinkers have talked about it. This is best captured, and this is where I thought about it for the first time in fairy tales. This is best captured by the evil queen. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And as long as the mirror says, you, my queen, are the fairest of them all, she feels great. As soon as there is one person who is more fair than thee, immediately she's mortified. The two components of self-esteem here. First of all, other determined. I'm asking a mirror to evaluate me, not self-determined. So my worthiness comes from an external source. And second, competence. I compare myself to others. Is there anyone who is fairer than I? Dependent self-esteem. Now, I've quite literally now caricatured dependent self-esteem. Let me make it this very clear. Everyone has some dependent self-esteem. There is no person that I've met or have heard of who is oblivious to what other people think or say, or to social comparisons. It's part of human nature. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. If we fight it, it will only intensify, as we've seen numerous examples throughout the semester. Permission to be human, and part of being human is that we all have some dependent self-esteem. The question is of degree. The important thing to understand about this model, the three levels, is that it's an epigenetic model. It is an epigenetic model. And I have no idea what that means. No. Epigenetic is that you first need to get past the first stage in order to get to the second stage. You first need to get past the second stage in order to get to the third stage. That you cannot skip, for example, from stage 1 to stage 3 without going through 2. So everyone experiences dependent self-esteem, always. However, after a time, if we have healthy dependence, which is natural, which we all have at an earlier age, later on it becomes independent. And if we're able to cultivate healthy independent self-esteem, we go up to the unconditional self-esteem, to the state of interdependence, which is the highest level. But even at that highest level, we still have remnants, and we'll always have elements of the dependent as well as the independent sense of self. When I started doing my research, initially, I depicted independent versus dependent, I hadn't thought of unconditional at the time, as independent good, dependent bad. And I tried to get rid of the dependent self. And what happened, it just simply intensified. It simply got stronger. and I became even more dependent. Whereas as soon as I started to accept it, remember, I talked about it, permission to be human. As soon as I accepted it as part of human nature, it actually lost much of its power over me. Still there, as it is for everyone. But the question is of a degree. The second level, self-esteem, independent self-esteem. As its name suggests, that's self-esteem that's not contingent on other people. So in terms of worthiness, I evaluate myself according to my own standards. I'm self-determined. I determine how good a book that I wrote is. Ultimately, the ultimate arbiter. I do take into consideration and listen to what other people are saying, but at the end of the day, I'm the one who decides. Competence, not comparison to others, but comparison to oneself. Have I improved? Am I a better writer today than I was in the past? Do I know more math today than I knew at the beginning of the semester? Am I able to apply more things from positive psychology than I applied initially? Not compared to my roommate who's applying so much more or so much less, but mostly focused on the self. Once again, people who wrote about this type of self-esteem, Nathaniel Branden, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and a handful of others. A person who has dependent self-esteem looks for constant approval, is afraid of criticism. Very often it's associated with perfectionism. Whereas a person who has an independent sense of self looks for criticism. In fact, that person constantly looks for beautiful enemies, people who will challenge him or her, who will help them in their apprenticeship to the truth, because they want to improve. Their motivation, their primary motivation is, what am I passionate about? What do I care about? What do I really, really want to do with my life? They're about pursuing self-concordant goals. A friend of mine, Mike Moldavano, philosopher, writes about dependent self-esteem. And he says that this person answers or is associated with the following. We say that we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. We say that we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. Many people with dependent self-esteem say, yes, I'm really pursuing what is right, what is true, what is noble. Whereas actually the motivation is protecting the self from criticism, from negative evaluation, from a lower sense of self-esteem that is contingent on others. And once again, in contrast to saying we want the truth, meaning we want to be correct, we have the person with independent self-esteem who wants beautiful enemies, who really is an apprentice to the truth. To summarize, initially the first 2 by 2, dependent self-esteem, worthiness determined by others. I do things for accolades, for praise primarily. And competence, how well am I doing relative to other people? Am I better or worse than them? And that determines my self-esteem. In terms of my worthiness, in terms of independent self-esteem, I compare myself to myself. Have I improved? Am I getting better? Am I learning? And my worthiness is determined by my own evaluation. Third level, unconditional self-esteem. In many ways, this is not even self-esteem because there is no esteeming involved here. The first component, worthiness, not contingent. It's not contingent on other people's evaluations. It's not even contingent on my evaluation. I'm confident enough not to be engaged in evaluations. In terms of competence, it's interdependent. I don't compare myself to how well I'm doing relative to others, nor even to how well I'm doing relative to myself. I'm in a state of being, interdependence with others, fully comfortable in my own skin. For example, a person writing a book who has high dependent self-esteem is primarily motivated by the accolades, by the praise that he or she will get. A person who has high dependent, and also by how well that book is doing relative to other books. A person with independent self-esteem writes a book and derives pleasure and satisfaction from writing better than he or she did in the past, from improving, as well as from self-evaluation of the book. This is good. A person who has unconditional self-esteem simply writes a book. Why? Because he or she wants, if they have a good idea, a good book to be out there. They derive as much satisfaction, as much pleasure when they see another person's book who is good. They're interdependent. They see themselves as one with others. Once again, everyone has some components of dependence, some components of independence, and some component of unconditional self-esteem. The question is of degree. The model is epigenetic. It takes a lifetime very often to cultivate more and more of the unconditional self. Now, one of the criticisms that I face and other writers who have written about unconditional self-esteem is that to be at this stage of where I don't really care or don't care that much about whether I get criticism or evaluation is that one becomes detached from others, that one does not care. But that is not the case. You see, there are many parallels between unconditional self-esteem and the Buddhist conception of detachment. Let me read to you something that was written by the Buddhist nun Thupten Chodron, and I quote, "Ordinarily, we become very upset when we are criticized or insulted. We're angry when our possessions are stolen. We're jealous if someone else gets the promotion we wanted. We're proud of our looks or our athletic ability. By contrast, when we reach this state of detachment, our mind becomes clearer and more capable of enjoying things for what they are. We live more in the present, appreciating things as they are now, without fantasies about what they are or will be. We become less ego-sensitive to every action other people do in relation to us." Now, at the same time, detachment or unconditional self-esteem, which is the parallel that I'm drawing, does not mean being indifferent or rejecting other people's feelings. She continues, "On the contrary, when we're not attached, our relationships with others are harmonious, and in fact, we care more about them. We become more compassionate, more empathic toward others." Detachment or unconditional self-esteem simply means that we are distancing ourselves or not experiencing as much feelings of jealousy, feelings of envy, constant superiority or inferiority, ongoing comparison to others. It means on many levels that we are one with them. This is what the research shows. In fact, you can think about unconditional self-esteem as parallel to going to a movie. When you go to a movie, what happens? You're empathizing with the characters there. When they go through a hard time, you experience a hard time viscerally. When they thrive and succeed, you thrive and succeed. You're one with them. Why? Because your ego is not threatened. You're not threatened by their success. Their good looks are not threatening to you. Their successes are not a threat to you. Why? Because it's just a movie. Now imagine if we could have these emotions, feeling with as opposed to against. Imagine if we can have these emotions in real life. How much more powerful would they be? This is the experience, again, of a movie, but so much more powerful because it's real, of a person who has high levels of unconditional self-esteem. Cultivating self-esteem, unconditional self-esteem, takes time. It's a lifelong process. In many ways, it's parallel to learning how to walk. What happens when we learn how to walk? Initially, we can't. After a while, we're able to get up, but we need some help. We're dependent on a chair, on our parents, to hold us, dependent on other people. Next level, after a while, is independent. We're able to walk by ourselves. But we walk still by thinking about picking up this foot, and we're precarious, we're uncertain, but we're independent. Later on, we simply and naturally walk. We don't need to think about it constantly. When it comes to a sense of self, initially there is no sense of self when we're born. After a while, the sense of self is dependent on other people, other people's evaluation. Then, after a while, we become independent of what other people say, or we try to assert our independence, but we're constantly evaluating ourselves, constantly comparing ourselves. And then finally, after a while, when we cultivate this strong sense of independence, we simply and naturally exist. That is, if nature is allowed to take its course, and that takes time. David Schnark talks about the average person at the age of 50 becoming known rather than validated, strong unconditional self-esteem. Maslow talks about the self-actualized person at the age of 45 or 50. That's unconditional self-esteem. It takes time. It's epigenetic. But the process itself, as we improve and grow, is or can be as enjoyable, as pleasurable as learning how to walk. I'll see you next week.